Evening, folks. Welcome back for another episode of Riftbound 101. This is the third one for this week, and today we're going to be covering Teemo in Focus, which should be an interesting video going into this week of the Houston event and a bunch of skirmish nights that are happening around. Well, I'm in Montreal, so around Montreal for me, but wherever you are. And yeah, before that, though, I want to give you a massive thanks for 1,000 of you subscribing to the channel. This is, again, kind of like a surreal event that it's happening this quickly and that so many of you are interested in the content. So hopefully it keeps being what you're interested in. And yeah, that's it for now. Here's to 2K. Not the game company, the viewer count. Today, what we're going to be talking about, much like the rest of our In Focus episodes, are core concepts, key pieces, as usual. But I want to talk about what happens a little bit when you have a legend like Teemo that is very novel and a bit more unknown and unexplored. When we talked about Victor, there was a lot of different versions of Victor that were popping up that were like getting a lot of testing. I think Teemo's kind of in the same boat, but with a lot less space covered and a lot more room for experimentation. And then at the end of this, I'm going to offer you a budget version of the deck that it has been performing very well for Prismaticism, as well as his actual deck list. And another one that popped up at the SFC event a couple days back that I think is maybe a bit interesting, if very weird for what I'm used to. So, Teemo, I think, unlike other legends that we've been covering more recently, really tells you what direction you're supposed to take with the deck. So he lets you hide cards by paying 1 energy instead of recycling a rune, although you can still use the recycle a rune option if you're ever out of resources. And his second ability allows you to pay 1 energy, exhaust Swift Scout, and then to play, to put a Teemo from either the champion zone or the board into your hand. And you might ask, okay, well, if it's on the board, I understand it's because I want to recycle it. What is the use of putting that card into your champ zone? It's to hide information. So if you bring back the Teemo into your hand and you hide a card, it might be that Teemo, but it might also be something else. So Teemo, more than most legends, will often play with showing your opponents information and not showing information. And if this is your first time playing TCGs, you might notice a lot of folks hand shuffling in general, but especially Teemo players will hand shuffle their cards so that you can't really tell if the card that they're playing is the Teemo that they brought back to their hand, or if it's another hidden card, or even the order that they keep cards in, which is generally a thing that TCG players do, but especially in this deck, I think it actually does matter. Okay. As usual, I love covering some main deck curves to give you an idea of kind of like the pace that you're playing at. And this is Prismat's main deck curve. So very heavy on 2 and 4 drops, especially 2 drops. And then fairly light, a couple of 5 and 6 spells, and 2 units at 7 and 8 energy, respectively. So this deck really wants to play small units and then hide cards around them. And I want to highlight that because a lot of these energy costs are actually kind of misleading. You're often not playing them for their upfront energy cost. You're going to be playing them for their hidden cost, which in this case is 1 or a recycled rune. And generally speaking, my sense from having watched tournament play and hearing Prismat talk about his deck and other players comment, you mostly want to be utilizing the energy if you can, so that you are not setting yourself back in terms of future plays, like not having enough energy to cast Watcher or not having enough energy to cast Mundo, which is the 8 cost card in this deck. The second main deck curve is from that SFC event. I was going to say SCG. And this deck actually runs a couple of seals, which is already a bit strange, and notably does not run either Thousand-Tailed Watcher or Mundo, and instead opts to run some large spells like Unchecked Power and Possession, and then we'll run a lot more hidden units. This is because, as like a highlight, this is actually more of a blue Teemo deck, and I'll talk about the the variance between the two. So in general, Teemo shines by combining a lot of hidden cards with cards that will pay you off for using the hidden effect. By default, hidden is a tricky mechanic. Like, it will allow you to swing tempo, or to like draw more cards, or somehow impact the board. But Teemo also utilizes cards that will reward you for having those hidden effects in on top of what you already get. And then it's a deck that tends to run a lot of card draw. So you're going to quickly cycle through your deck to find specific answers for whatever matchup you're facing. And often you're digging for Mundo to be able to play in the late game. So the main deck that Prismat was running runs 11 hidden cards, which you can consider hidden one-drop plays. This includes the Teemo and the Champ Zone. And the +2 comes from Guerrilla Warfare, which allows you to bring back 2 cards with hidden from your graveyard to your hand, and also removes all hidden costs from cards that you play that turn, so you can actually hide a bunch of stuff for very little energy. So in effect, what happens is you play Guerrilla Warfare for 2, you recycle a rune, and then you can hide both of the cards that you just got for 0, which means you're effectively playing them for 1 each, like Teemo's ability. There are about 17 pieces of interaction. This is split between units and spells that affect combat. So a fair amount of it, and a lot of card draw. So about 15, and I count things like Traveling Merchant as 1 card draw, but you can actually move Traveling Merchant a lot backwards and forwards to draw more cards. And for example, moving Traveling Merchant into something like Zon Warrens will actually make you discard 2 cards and draw 2. So this is a deck where you will probably see a fair amount of it and most copies of cards that you have. So we can talk about filtering, right? Teemo, because Teemo is going to see that many cards, you're often going to find everything that you need. And in general, if you are towards the mid or end state of a game, you will probably find Mundo and be able to slam him on the board. I think Mundo in a defensive position is much stronger. So if you're holding somewhere and you can play Mundo and hide a card next to him, it can get really intense. And when Mundo is out, all your spells that draw you cards and cycle themselves will all of a sudden become like massive swings for him. So for example, Stupefy will give a unit -1. We'll also go to the graveyard giving Mundo +1, and we'll draw you a card, which might be something else that you can play also. Okay, so the key pieces, I think, in Teemo decks are a bit more straightforward to understand than some of the other like very wide-ranging decks. It's just that the application of them is going to be very flexible. So you have your hidden enablers, so the cards that are hidden themselves or that you can hide. You have your multipliers, and then you're going to have a couple of endgame closers, which is pretty common for most decks. Your hidden staples are cards like Teemo Scout himself. Most decks I've seen tend to play Purple Teemo as the champion of choice, and it allows you to have like a pretty intense, like if you're on the start, you can play something like Traveling Merchant, move him to Bandle Tree, hide Scout Teemo and hide another card, and all of a sudden it's pretty scary, and then you can even play an Ember Monk on that location, and all of a sudden people are going to really get scared. But you're going to play things like Sprite Calm, which are also like combat swings that are hidden. Fight or Flight will often mess up the math for your opponent, or outright push something like a Watcher back to base, negating like a really big attack. Most decks, Fight or Flight, actually prefer to cast from hand because it allows you to target multiple battlefields. Teemo might be one of the exceptions where you actually do like playing it more hidden, but be aware of the flexibility of both versions of it. And then Consult the Past is just like fantastic to hide. Often you're going to get to draw 2 cards for 1 energy. That's maybe the best rate for card draw in the game, and you're happy activating this if some removal is aimed at your unit that's holding to force you to flip a small Teemo or something. You're happy to just play Consult. So most of what your hidden cards do is going to be to affect the battlefield itself or to draw you more cards directly. This is a deck that does not run a ton of unit removal per se, although it does run generally 2 copies of Singularity, which you do like playing a lot. But otherwise, you're going to be really interacting with creatures on the battlefield with Stupefy and putting out like buffs for your own units or moving stuff around. And then you have like your hidden multipliers. So I talked about Guerrilla Warfare. Prismat's deck plays 1 copy. I've seen decks that play 2. I really love this. And Guerrilla Warfare, I think, is a card that will scale with time as more and more good hidden cards are printed. You're going to like getting them back and multiplying them. So this kind of card is, I think, useful as a one-of, and it's kind of dead if you draw it and you don't have anything to recycle. So I don't think it's going to be played as a 3-of in any Teemo decks for the foreseeable future. 2 depends on the version, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Ember Monk is another card that's seeing a ton of play as a full set. 4 might for 4 energy is kind of okay, but once it becomes a 6, it's already like pretty scary, and often one of the plays that you're going to see is like placing an Ember Monk as a holder on Bandle Tree with 2 hidden cards, which by default would make him an 8 might unit. And then if you're flipping a Teemo, you're actually sitting on about 12 power, and then if it's something like a Sprite's Call, a very small amount of creatures all of a sudden can go up to like 17 might to defend, which is a crazy swing. And speaking of Bandle Tree is, I think, one of the rare inclusions of an auto-include battlefield for 1 legend that sees play nowhere else. So Bandle Tree is only used by Teemo, and rightfully so, because it gets you the most value. Most decks will not be running enough hidden effects to like double hide. You might run into the odd like double hide hidden blade, but you can kind of tell that that's what's happening. So it'll be a bit weird. And also double hidden blade is not always like a fantastic play to have. For example, if somebody's hiding like those 2 and holding with only 1 unit, and you singularity it, all of a sudden they have to utilize 1 hidden blade and lose the other. It's not great for anybody except for Teemo. And then Teemo himself, the Swift Scout, I think is also something you can qualify as a multiplier. You're often going to be bringing back your Scout Teemo and recomboing it with other hidden spells and hand shuffling so that opponents will never tell if you've just put another Teemo on the board. And I really want to stress, like, Teemo does something that Shen does for yellow decks. So for example, if you play Traveling Merchant and all of a sudden somebody, just Hextech raise it very quickly, then you can flip up your purple Teemo and it'll be at 4 might for the rest of the turn. It's really hard to remove. It'll let you hold. And you can play another unit, bring Teemo back to your hand and play it again. And just kind of set up opponents for failure constantly. The game enders, I think generally, like if you're looking at Prismat's deck, there's 3 that you have on hand. You have your singularities, which will often allow you to like double tap big units, or even 2 mid-sized units, and especially in base, which will like make your opponent's offensive crumple. It can hit Darius, it can hit Vi, it can hit Yellow Victor sitting in base. Has a lot of good targets. Red Kaisa. Like 6 damage is pretty hefty and will probably remove most things. It doesn't do well, for example, against Mind Splitter or Aurora decks, but you're kind of so aggressive against Aurora decks that I don't think that that's much of a problem. And then Mundo is your answer to a lot of those games that go long, right? So I've seen Mundos go up to 18, 19 might by themselves. They're ginormous. And then they start recycling your trash so that you won't go through your entire deck and give opponents victory points, which is what happens if you actually run out of cards in your deck and you have to draw. Then you shuffle your graveyard into your deck and opponents get a point, which can win them the game because it's off cycle. So Mundo, fantastic. Actually been dropping in price recently. So normally he's a card that I might not include. I wouldn't have included a couple weeks ago in the budget version. At this point, if you want to play blue and you want to play like a heavy draw blue shell, which is either for Teemo or for Ari, just get 2 Mundos. That'll be great. And then you have all your draw spells, right? So I put these later, although they are kind of staples, because Mundo himself really is only as good as your graveyard is full. You don't want to play like a 6 might unit for 8 energy plus the runes. It's not good. So you're going to have some units that draw you cards like Lecturing Yordle, but really it's the spells that are the stars. So things like Stupefy and Consult the Past. Stack deck is, for most decks, I wouldn't like really classify it as pure card draw or pure card advantage, because you're actually getting deck selection instead. You're paying 1 to have stack deck replace itself with the best of the 3 cards on top of your deck, and then losing the other 2. However, because you're actually cycling this card into your graveyard, Mundo also gets stronger. So I really do like stack deck. And stack deck, when Mundo is defending, gets really strong, for example, if you can draw into a Stupefy, and all of a sudden you're putting 2 cards into your graveyard, -1 to your opponent's unit, and you draw another card. You can like really swing combat strongly. So don't sleep on draw. Generally good, even better with Mundo. And then I talked about Bandle Tree really quickly, but I want to stress this again. You can only hide 1 card in most battlefields, except for Bandle Tree, and oftentimes this is a field that gives you value and gives nothing to your opponents. It's fantastic. Zon Warrens is kind of the second inclusion, especially if you're playing Mundo, because it will feed the Mundo and it will find him faster, so you kind of love having it. And then there's some discussion about open battlefields. Prismat plays Trifarian War Camp. That should be TWC. I don't know why I said TFW, but anyways. And Trifarian War Camp will just like give you a little bit more might, and you do tend to play multiple small units, so you're not as like annoyed by it as something like a Yi deck that's only playing 1 unit. Some other decks play Alter Unity, so holding gives you more recruits, or Fortified Position, which allows you to defend a bit better. It's going to depend on your game plan, and I have a sense that this battlefield is probably the one that's going to get swapped out relatively early once we hit Spirit Forge, and there are like new options for people to include. But, you know, feel free to utilize whatever you find works best for your playstyle, and especially the style of Teemo that you're playing. Now, I want to make sure before I speak out of turn. This is a wrong slide. I forgot to do the matchup slide for this. Matchups with Teemo are actually fairly strange, and my sense from what I've heard Prismat talk, when I've heard Prismat talk about the deck, is that Teemo suffers from the same kind of issues that Victor can suffer from, which is sort of sitting on battlefields with open units really lets you get punished by certain spells. Teemo can't really counterspell. So, for example, if you are on just a small unit and you get Hextech Raid or you get Falling Starred, there's not much you can do about it, which makes red like a really good color into Teemo. You can play around it, and I think that's going to be the difference between good and great Teemo players, is going to be figuring out how to manipulate information such that you can play around Kaisa and Annie big spells. I do think, for example, that Annie in general, Teemo has a bit more of an easy time with because of the Ride the Wind combo. So because Annie likes to play Vi Ride the Wind, you can a bit more easily utilize things like Fight or Flight in response. And so I think Teemo wins a bit less than so it's like win rate's probably like a 45-55 or something of that something around that number for these matchups. However, I do think that Teemo just pretty much dominates like an Aurora matchup where people are trying to go late. It also will tend to do very well against decks that want to run units into you. So I think something like Hook Darius in general is going to struggle a little bit with the Teemo matchup. And this is where the Mundo comes to play, really. If you can get Mundo on the board against red, there's not much that can be done to get him off the board. Teemo really suffers, I think, more than any other deck into Victor currently, because things like Call the Weak will just like kind of clear your battlefields if everything you have is hidden. But I say this with a caveat. Teemo decks currently are highly experimental. Prismat's running one, but the variation is so wide among like the less well-performing decks that I'm not comfortable like commenting purely on like what you should or shouldn't be running against Teemo, or if you are running Teemo, what you should be doing against these matchups. Play to your field and really try to utilize the toolbox nature of Teemo, and I think you're going to be able to snag some matches that otherwise you wouldn't be able to, especially because not a lot of people have experience playing into Teemo. And that, I think, is the more interesting aspect of this deck relative to something flexible like Victor, is that on average, people are already not really used to playing against purple Teemo, and that will give you some edge. And then the other thing that's going to happen with this is blue Teemo is basically unseen except for that SFC event that I'm going to show you the list for. And blue Teemo I like less, but I think there's a case for playing as well, and is going to scale with more hidden effects as we go into the future sets that are coming out. So, purple Teemo costs 1 to hide or 2 to play. You probably always hide him, and when he flips, you're going to get that 4 might. Blue Teemo only has 2, but can actually use removal based on how many hidden cards you see. So, they do not play at all the same. Blue Teemo really likes the sort of all-in hidden archetype more than anything else, and I think is maybe hammered a little bit more by the fact that Bandle Tree is only a battlefield that you can use 1 out of 3 games, usually your opening game, by the way. So as we get more hidden cards, and this will become like a potent unit, you might see more blue Teemos, and you might also see just blue Teemo in other blue shells. I wouldn't be surprised to see like a blue Teemo inclusion in the Renata Glask version that's coming out, like with the control spells. So, be on the lookout. But I think the blue Teemo is a bit more casino-y as well. Like you're gonna have to random how much damage you get, and that's like a bit more complicated than just having like a 4-power unit. So yeah, the math on this really is like if you flip blue Teemo, you have to hit like 3 out of 5 of your cards have to be hidden cards for him to have the same power as purple Teemo. Technically, his ceiling's a bit higher because he can get up to 7 instead of 4, but it's a lot harder to do that, and you're often not going to run, like up your 40 card hidden deck. If that ever becomes possible, blue Teemo is going to be great. But he also uses energy. Well, only if you play. Anyways. So the budget version that I'm going to propose to you is slightly less budget than usual. And it's just a downgraded, downcycled version of Prismat's list. And the cards in here that are driving the price up really are the 3-stack decks, the Guerrilla Warfare, and then the Mundos. Everything else in here is either like $1, sub $1 chaff, or it's like Sprite Mother, which is like a couple dollars. But I'm comfortable recommending getting like Mundo and Stack Deck, even if you're not going to be playing Teemo for a long time, and the Teemo champion himself is like $1 as well. And feel free to replace Stack Deck with something else that's in the sideboard list, and upgrade into it as you get them. Having 1 Stack Deck is great in this deck, and having more is useful, but it's not as make or break as when you're playing like a Nocturne deck, right? I really do love it, and I don't think I would recommend you to not play Stack Deck. Just like go with the flow. And then the 1 Guerrilla Warfare, if you don't have access to it, I think I would just like replace with another Singularity, and that would be quite fine. But, this deck basically will work off of the bones that are at common and uncommon. And you can run like triple Raza if you don't have any Mundos, and that's going to be fine. You're not going to have as much top end, but while you're learning the deck and while you're deciding if you want to stick with it, I think this is a version that you can be fairly happy with. So yeah, that would be like my recommendation for the budget Teemo. And I think the price for this is around like 44 US. I think if you drop the stack decks from the prices I was looking at stores earlier, you're going to drop into like a $20 version of the deck. So it's going to be like cheaper than most starters are to build. And then, yeah, the decks that are coming out right now, I think are experimental. I'm actually curious to see if Prismat will be at Houston and if he will be running this deck again and what it will look like now. I think he just ran it back at a Cash Cup for Rift and Runes, which he topped. So this is his deck, which is really like the full budget version of the deck I was just showing you, where the Razas are moved to the sideboard, the spells change a little bit, and you're running like 2 more Watchers. And that's really it. Like this deck has a very low price ceiling, and the Watchers are the most expensive cards, and they're great, but the deck is playable without it. And notably, the runes that you're running in this deck, if you're playing like a BO1 event and you're not siding, you can actually play this deck as a 12 Calm Rune deck. The Chaos runes are really there for when you're running Raza and Rebuke. But otherwise, this is like fully a blue deck. And if you're ever running like BO1 or you don't sideboard when you're playing with friends, you can actually just like remove the sideboard and swap to 12 runes, and you're going to have like a much easier time matching color costs. But really, that's like it. I don't have like this deck is really like the version that we currently have of Purple Teemo that seems to be performing the best. The one that I think is funnier is the SFC pre-launch Blue Teemo that I was talking about a bit earlier. This deck is completely crazy to me. It runs way less card draw, but it runs triple Blue Teemo, triple Purple Teemo, double Guerrilla Warfare, and it runs Blast Cone Phase as hiddens, and then it runs triple Unchecked Power and one Possession. This is like a hyper-controlling deck. The Unchecked Power tech is truly funny because you can jam in very small units, force your opponents to commit a lot because of the hidden effects, and then just play it to clear them out. But like this is a hardcore control deck. Like one Falling Comet, triple Singularity, triple Unchecked Power, and Possession is about as like slow cannon as I can imagine Teemo playing. And I think this version is it's about as heavy, I think, on the hidden effects. So it's like 3, 9, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. So it's at 15 that I can clock like really quickly, plus the 2 Guerrilla Warfares, which is like another 4 cards. It's heavier on the hidden for sure, but I don't think it's demonstrably heavier on it than some of the other decks. And the seals are a bit questionable to me. Blue Teemo is just like a wide unexplored space, but I want to show you a list so you can get an idea of what it would look like if you were interested in playing it. I think you run this at a Nexus night, nobody's going to have any idea what you're playing. So, you know, feel free to sort of try this out if you have the cards, but otherwise I think this is a bit more of an expensive list that is not really targeting its card purchases at staples. So it's a bit more risky. And the price points for this, I think, are fairly interesting as well, because the budget version's a bit sub $50, but then like Prismat's Purple Teemo is like 95, and really it's the 2 Watchers, and that makes this deck have like a competitive price point that is like a quarter of sets and like 1/10 of Yi or Kaisa, depending on the market that you're in. This is like truly a cheap deck. So if you're like not sitting on a lot of money and you have like a Watcher or 2, I would just like fill this deck out. I would try to play it, and if you like it, stick with it. And the Blue Teemo is more expensive just because it runs triple Teemo and triple Unchecked Power, which are a bit more expensive, and you have a second copy of Gorilla. Like, I really want to stress, like, Teemo is fertile ground for experimentation, and I think this is going to be a hero that's going to find a lot of new versions as we move forward, and there's going to be like more hidden cards for you to play. And also, if they ever print more Teemo champion units, then things are going to get pretty interesting as well in terms of what you can play and utilize Teemo's bounce back to hand option. So yeah, my recommendation, as always, is go into the budget version, downgrade even more if you feel like you need to, and then just pick up some of the blue staples that you have around you. If you are trying to just like complete this deck, you can also wait for some restock to happen over the holiday season. Prices are already going down a little bit. And Teemo is sitting pretty well. The one thing that would be scary would be if over the Houston weekend, like 4 Teemos top 8, then all of a sudden Teemo prices are going to skyrocket. But we'll see. There's not like any other major competitive event coming after Houston before the new year, aside from some skirmish events. So I don't foresee like crazy drive the way that there has been up to now to procure these cards. Anyways, that's the Teemo spiel. And I think if you're into Teemo, one of the interesting things with this is you're going to be able to find your style and to pivot around a lot of these like key cards. And as we move into the next set, you're probably going to find like some new toys to play with that might be super interesting as well. So, you know, keep an eye out, and hopefully you're gonna find a version of this that works for you, and maybe you can clobber some Kaisa players by paying 1/10 of their budget, which is always kind of satisfying. The plan for next weekend or next week is to swap back to 2 episodes a week for now. We'll see how that works out in terms of timing. So Monday and Wednesday, and Monday's episode is largely going to be focused on starting to discuss Spiritforged. And I'm still figuring out the format, but I think we're going to start talking about specific colors and evaluating, how they scale up currently. And I'm sure I'm going to make a ton of mistakes evaluating those, but it'll be interesting to move on to some new information as the full set has just been revealed and put out in English by Riot. So I'm excited for that, and probably talk a little bit about what happened over the weekend at Houston. Although, if you are looking for somewhere to watch, I'm pretty sure the Houston event's going to be broadcast on the Riot Games main YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for that. Thanks again, and hopefully if you're a Teemo player, this is going to be super useful as a starting point for you. And if you are a Teemo player and you're very experienced and you have lists for like Blue Teemo, I'd be super curious to see what you're working on and how it's succeeding. Otherwise, next week is Spirit Forged, and then I think it's Darius? I think it's Darius for next Wednesday. All right, thanks, and have a nice weekend. And if you're watching Houston, have a nice regional event.